So it's great to have you here today. Oh, hello, Monica. Excellent. Glad we made it virtually. So today, this session is about it matters where you're born. So what data tells us about geographical inequalities and how to address them. So I'll give you a bit of a flavour about the session today. So first of all, we've got 30 minutes. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. You can put it in the Q&A. And if we've got time, we'll make sure we'll come to your questions too. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists today, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. So should I start off with you, Monica? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Lisa, and I'm very honored to be sharing my thoughts on data geographic inequalities and why we must address them alongside my peers. So my name is Monica Ndiga. I'm the Regional Director, Eastern and Southern Africa with the Humanitarian Openstreetmap team. The Humanitarian Openstreetmap team develops open source applications and tools for collaborative mapping and geospatial data collection. So we're working together with open mapping organizations and communities to build a free and open map of the world, so using OpenStreetMap. So, and for those who are not familiar with OpenStreetMap, it is a Wikipedia of maps. So it's a public good so that valuable data, can be created and used by all local actors. And the data that you find on OpenStreetMap is free. It's open to access, use, as well as for downloads. Some of our partners and some of the people that have leveraged OpenStreetMap tools include Red Cross societies, Medicine Sans Frontiers, local governments, local non-governmental organizations, and communities in different parts of the world. Thank you, Lisa.
Excellent. Thank you, Monica. And over to you, Nadine.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here as well. I'm the CEO of the Open Geospatial Consortium. We are a global not-for-profit consortium, although I like to think of the C and OGC more as a community, and a community of geospatial leaders and users literally worldwide, trying to make an impact with their geospatial power. I call it collective problem-solving power, now that geospatial is everywhere. Location data is literally everywhere, and it connects everything. So we try to do these connections via geospatial, internationally ratified standards. And you think about data, it's space, it's Internet of Things, it's drones, it's autonomous vehicles. It's amazing times, so I'm very happy to be here. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, so I really, really know that it matters where you're born because it impacts the rest of your life, and accessibility to data. Hopefully we'll have some good conversation around that.
Excellent, thanks Nadine. And then over to you, Ros.
Hi, I'm Rosling. I'm Deputy Director for Strategy at the Geospatial Commission. I just want to thank you and my panelists for having me today. The Geospatial Commission is an executive committee of the Cabinet Office. We're responsible for increasing and improving the use of location data across both the public and private sector. In June 2020, we published a UK-wide strategy with the aim to unlock the significant economic, environmental and social benefits offered by location data across 4 missions of work: developing the policy context, improving the actual data, increasing skills, and driving innovation. I guess for today's conversation, I really wanted just to make 2 points at the start. For me, geospatial is a way of showing up inequality, overlaying administrative data about people, their lives, their jobs, their incomes at varying resolutions is a key mechanism to understand the inequalities across the world. But also importantly for me, location data can help us with identifying where to implement interventions and then monitoring their impact. Nadine already mentioned, a number of kind of things that location data can support, but for me, piloting transport infrastructure to stimulate economic growth in certain regions. So I'm really looking forward to kind of having some questions and continuing this conversation.
Brilliant, thank you all. So this came out of really discussions internally for us, was when we looked at, in 2006, some of you might have seen the late Hans Rosling presented the best stats you've ever seen. And this blew all the previous assumptions about demographics wide open. So it was saying soon population growth would level off and poverty would decline and our health outcomes would improve, especially in the global south, which obviously sounds great news if you're looking at data visualization and modeling for the future. But what does this actually mean for people living in those regions that are disproportionately poor and affected by conflict, disease, or climate change today? So what does that tell us about the geographical inequalities and how we're going to address them? So if I take my first question then to you, Monica, and feel free if anybody in the audience has got questions in the chat, I'll come to them. So Monica, what do you think the data tells us about those geographical inequalities?
Yes, so when I think about what data tells us about geographical inequalities, my mind goes to actually the lack of the data, not so much of where we have the data, but looking at where there are inequalities in terms of lack of data, or the existence of data that is very general in terms of quality, in terms of scope, and secondly and thirdly, data that is inaccessible. So more than 1 billion people live in places that are not on the map, and many of these unmapped places are essentially high-risk places prone to disasters. They're also home to people experiencing multidimensional poverty, so lack of access to healthcare, poor education, etc. And that lack of data then turns out to be very personal. So not being represented on the map means as an individual, I will miss out on access to everyday services like healthcare and education. But on a more granular level, when we think of a worst case scenario of a humanitarian crisis or a disaster, this means life, a matter of life and death. And if responders, for example, do not have data or infrastructure, or if they don't know where people are, then they cannot provide the desperately needed supports. It becomes a very cyclical kind of cycle. So where the lack of up-to-date data, the lack of accessible or good quality data, in turn then leads to inequality in actual response efforts. Again, widening the geographical sort of inequalities. And when you look at the map and places where we lack the data or we have very limited data, the characteristics are very similar. So we're looking at the multidimensional inequalities. We are looking at segregation by, political affiliation. We are looking at low civic or even low civic engagement or lack of, strengthened institutions in terms of leading citizen engagement, and also sort of gaps in citizen-led or supported self-reporting where people are able to actually share what affects their day-to-day kind of lives.
Excellent. Yeah, that's quite a worrying statistic, isn't it? There's 1 billion people that are not on the map, and that impact that has on them for the inequalities. So what about you, Nadine, then? So what do you think the data tells us about those geographical inequalities?
Yeah, I would echo Monica's points. Actually, if I can build on those, one point is, so from the OGC perspective, when we're trying to use standards to make geospatial data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, right? I cannot tell you, Lisa, how confusing it is that with all the technological and innovation advances that we have today, I keep going back to, we are flying a helicopter on Mars, controlling it remotely, getting pictures, but yet, think about it, information here on Earth is still not fair, and especially during disasters. Seriously, take any flood, any recent wildfire, anywhere, developing or developed world, and take the pandemics as another example, and it becomes very painfully clear that the information that you need, when it's urgent, it's not findable. If you can't access it, you can't reuse it. The other thing I'd like to say was, I was reading literally yesterday, about Africa, going back to the question, it matters where you're born. So I was reading that Africa has 1/8 the minimum density of weather stations that are recommended by the WMO, the World Met Organization, which means it's not only they're not getting accurate forecasts, and they're not getting early warning systems that are as sophisticated as the technology that we have today. But if you think about it more, it means globally, COP26 is this week. So the climate change models, right? It's impacting those global climate change models because there's no data in these, pockets on our Earth. So how do you tackle the difficult problems like Monica's mentioned when you don't have the data? You have the technology, but sometimes you don't have the data.
Yeah, no, they're really good points. I think that findability one obviously has been close to my heart from work I've done in the past about just, you know, the data's there, but you can't even find it. And Roz, would you like to come in on that? Because I know obviously you guys have been doing some work on that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess so many things I could kind of mention, but from a UK perspective, FAIR is right at the core of what we're trying to do here. And I guess that kind of really comes to my bigger point, which is that there is, of course, significant inequality at macro levels across whole regions of the globe, but actually within countries, within small areas, that the difference can be really big as well. So I think the one thing for me that geospatial data kind of comes into its own is it can provide that resolution at different levels to enable kind of effective decision making on the ground when we do get that data right, or that's what we should be aspiring to try to do, to be able to aggregate up microscopic experiences so that we can build a macro picture. And in some ways, you know, the weather kind of example Nadine just used is kind of perfect. I suspect near where there are 1 or 2 weather stations, they probably get a better picture. But actually, you know, even just a few miles down the road and there isn't one, that might have a really big impact on the services that are offered, the early warning signals and all of those things that are coming through.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose it leads us to thinking about, so do you think, how can geospatial data then enable us to better understand people's daily lives and struggles, but not in a creepy way, because that can sound bad, couldn't it? So I don't know, who wants to come in on that one first?
I'm happy to, if you want me. I think we're all in agreement here. Geospatial data has this power connected to it because it connects. It literally connects other data. I look at it as the glue. And interestingly, today there's more data than ever that's collected from everywhere, right? And at the same time, the basics are not there. It's interesting. So we were doing workshops in the US under the Geospatial Data Act, and we were asking across the nation, what are your data gaps, thinking it could be Earth observation or one of, I call them the sexy data types, but they end up being addresses and parcels. So, you know, you were still at the lowest common denominator. And then I go back to the challenges we're facing today. I'll hit on it again. Climate change is it's just a timely thing that's happening this week. Requires data integration, underground, overground, and it impacts this integration. The patterns that you get from using the location part of data tells you about people's mobility patterns, right? About their lifestyle preferences, about their energy consumption, about disease spread. So I can go on, but I think the power of geospatial, it enables the patterns to pop up and then to be communicated and decisions to be made accordingly.
Yeah, no, I think that's some really good points. And Monica, would you want to come in on that point?
Yes, to build on that, when geospatial data is combined with crowdsourced information especially, we achieve a level of detail and scope that enables us to see how individuals interact daily with infrastructure across sectors. And map data especially can be used virtually in any fields. When it comes to health, how private sector run businesses to help us kind of identify problems and respond to events. And with crowdsourced data as well, crowdsourced information, I find that we move away from just knowing, say, where the roads are, where the urban areas are, the buildings and networks, to a more detailed analysis on how people are using these roads, or why they don't use these roads, or why they're misusing, roads. So, and this really is the kind of the basis or the huge contributor for like economic models or how people run businesses. So I think for geospatial data to help us better understand people's daily lives, and there needs to be an aspect of crowdsourcing information, geospatial data in combination with kind of demographic data, to be able to understand the different kind of complexities and risk around data.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And what about you, Ros? What are your thoughts on how can geospatial better enable the understanding of people's daily lives and struggles?
So I think I'd reiterate the point about location data being that connector, and just take it to the visualization power, the picture that a map can provide, gives it another layer of accessibility for people. Because, you know, data literacy, being able to understand what's being shown on a spreadsheet is not accessible, but actually putting it into a map, people being able to identify where they are on that map, but then kind of have that picture around it, I think is a really important part. The other point I just wanted to make, Lisa, was kind of your half point at the start, actually, around, you know, making sure that we use location data in a way that retains the public's confidence, and that isn't creepy, where there are the right kind of support and regulations. And I think this is really important in the, I think, the ever important use of mobility data. So data that kind of tracks movement of people or goods or vehicles through, and that enables, as Monica was saying, us to understand where people are using certain roads or not using certain roads, and that power is really important. But we need to do that globally in a way that brings the people with us and confidence in that data can be used in the right way to benefit them.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose it brings in some of the work that's been done recently on data ethics, isn't it, with the Locus Charter for geospatial, and really trying to not have that creepy factor that's in there. It was funny. I was on a panel only a few weeks ago, and that was the summary was, you know, where's the balance? And it was like, just don't be creepy, and it's putting that into policies and processes. We've got a question in the chat. I can see there's a few actually coming into the chat rather than the Q&A, but I'll go to the Q&A. So there's one here about mapping vulnerabilities is important for addressing climate change action. But however, who has access to do such mapping, and how might people feel about being labelled as vulnerable? So is there anybody who wants to come in about thinking about how people might feel about being labelled as vulnerable, and how we can use that data for tackling climate change?
We're all vulnerable. That's I think honestly we're all vulnerable in different ways when we're talking about climate change, and mostly also because we don't fully understand it. That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand, you know, where we're going, how fast we're going, and what we can do. And in many ways, you know, the developing world is, they tell you, buy land in Canada right now, because in like another 50 years, it would be all green there. So you have the migration patterns that are coming up, right? I don't know about vulnerability. Honestly, we're all vulnerable. That's why it's a global cause.
Yeah, no, excellent. Would anybody else like to come in on that? Or should I just jump to one of the other questions? So, Monica, there was one about the billion people not on the map, as a question about, do you have a source for that they can reference? So Rose would like to know if you've got a source for that fact, quote.
Yes, so I have a source for that for that quote, and I think I observed somebody shared a link to that. The 1 billion quote is actually looking at 94 countries globally, both in Africa, Asia Pacific region, Latin America region, and looking at kind of the different factors that lead to vulnerability. So specifically looking at multidimensional poverty indexes that have been developed around communities living in areas prone to disaster. So that is how the 1 billion kind of our computation came about. But I will share also a link on the chat to help with that.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really helpful. So thinking about this, Ros, how do you think geospatial data can help inform the solutions and where things aren't working today? What's your view on that?
So at the Geospatial Commission, we really try to do a use case approach, building up pilots, and I think in the same way that famous saying, I think originating from a US politician, that politics is local, economics is local, and being able to pilot stuff in areas to take learnings from those areas, evaluate that, using the location data to understand both the area and the differences between areas can really drive some of that economic growth that will hopefully lead to a reduction in the inequality.
Excellent. No, that's a good shout. And what about you, Nadine? What are your thoughts on that, about how it can help inform those solutions and where those things aren't working?
So two thoughts come to mind. One of them is going back, like if geospatial is about the patterns that it helps us see that are not obvious, the two things would be visualization, just simply visualizing these complex patterns so that decision makers can figure out a way out. But also digital twins, right? I think this is why you hear a lot about them, because they enable you to do these complex simulations so that you can figure out when things are not working. You run these simulations in these very authentic, essentially, environments, like almost, right, digital twins, so that you understand the what ifs, and then you can inform a solution that's sort of been tested in the virtual world in a way. And then you can apply it in the real world.
Perfect. And you, Monica, what are your thoughts on that?
When I reflect on that, there's a group that comes to mind, Resilience Mappers in Uganda. So a mapping community that was established to quickly kind of provide map data requests in areas where governments and aid agencies have intervention programs in Uganda. But what we've learned from that is that from the very onset, the data initially requested was the data request came in from like a local authority, so the Kampala Capital City Authority. And so that from that initial stage of let's build something, let's create data to inform a solution to solve a challenge, it was very much a collaborative effort or a very inclusive process. And what that has offered them is a bit of ease when it comes to how they create that data, how it's validated, and how that data is updated regularly, because that's when we often come across like huge challenges in terms of keeping the data up to date, in terms of ensuring that it actually serves a real need or a need that exists within a community, first of all, and then everybody else that kind of makes policy decisions. So when I think about how to inform solutions through data, then I think of a lot of collaboration, which is not easy or even a straight line, but often helps to kind of navigate any kind of bottlenecks, further down the line.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And Nadine, and what sort of innovations do you think will enable us to achieve greater equality across the world? Is there anything you can see coming across the horizon that should help with that?
I mean, there's so much, but I think we go back to how we started. I don't think the issue is which innovations. We have plenty. I think I see an issue getting those innovations to operations, right? Going back to actually the problem is in the lower levels rather than the more sexy stuff. So our issue is getting innovation to operations and also getting concepts done at scale and repeatedly, because we do spend our resources doing the same thing over and over again. It's getting the technology. I see in the chat, for example, the Earth observations, the weather data, the ground stations from the AWS, in the hands of those who actually need it, literally everywhere. So I mentioned one of our innovation projects was about disaster response in Peru, the Peruvian Space Agency. And, you set up the project and you say, let's put the data in the cloud. And they say, wait, what does that mean to put the data in the cloud? How do you interact with the cloud? How do you set it up? How do you query? So all of this it's not innovation. It's honestly, it becomes capacity building on what we already know and has been proven. And then I go back to Monica, doing it, please, collaboratively, so we're not all reinventing the wheel. And I think that's why the UNGGIM has been pushing, an interoperability framework. They have a private sector network to help bridge that divide in capacity building and just tech, not necessarily innovations.
No, I think that's a really good point. I love that phrase, actually, innovations to operations. So actually make sure that you're using it rather than it just being the next shiny thing. I think that's a really good point. And what about you, Ros? What do you think about those innovations or operations to help us achieve that greater equality across the world?
Well, I think I'd just like to give an example of what I think is, you know, we're touching climate change, and of course, really current at the moment. And though, to be honest, for the rest of our future, but asking questions about where we put stuff is a first step. You know, where do you put the wind farm? But actually, one of the kind of innovative things that we've been funding recently, a company called Analytics, is actually saying, okay, well, if you put the wind farm in this position, which is maybe the best place for it from a weather perspective, but if that's in the middle of a shipping lane, and then all the ships are having to go a longer or a diverted route round, well, that's going to have a negative impact on the climate. So for me, there is something about location data being able to not just ask that initial question, really important question of where best at a first step, but that just it's not necessarily even innovation of technology. It's innovation of thought, and I think as both Monica and Nadine have thought about collaboration, having those different thoughts and different thinking, so that we actually come up with the right answer that's driving the outcomes that we want operationally at the end point.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, isn't it? Yeah, that wouldn't be very good in the shipping lane if you did that. Not great for climate change. And Monica, what about your thoughts on this?
I share similar sentiments in that it's kind of two tiers. And the first tier, which is kind of, let me say, technological innovation, we do have space for, you know, kind of AI, machine learning. And I think the space in that is kind of fast tracking how quickly, for example, we get the very basic infrastructure on a map. So the roads, the main roads, kind of on a map. But then beyond that, I feel that is where now the concept of social innovation, which is even more difficult, comes in, because more often than not, you will need human beings to actually go there and add, you know, different attributes to validate whether the, you know, kind of the AI data is representative. And I feel that is where it becomes what is called heavy on organizations or local organizations that are actually doing the mapping or that are actually adding these data points. Because realistically, if you think about having to say, put 1,000 attributes on a map in a day, for example, and think of a country like Kenya that has 52 million people, some quick math will tell you that will take quite a while or a long time to actually just validate and ground truth that kind of data. So I do think there is space for, say, AI-assisted mapping, yes, but then for credibility, for kind of accuracy, then we do need ground truthing and validation. And that is where now the use of the technology becomes really, really important. And without that, then we basically have good, you know, kind of neat technology. Nobody knows it, nobody's using it. And so it's not serving kind of the purpose or making a change actually in the world.
That's brilliant, thank you. Well, that half an hour shot past record speed, probably because we're talking about geospatial data. So I just want to thank you all for your contributions today. It's been really excellent. I think we've learned a lot about, you know, geospatial being the glue, which I think we'd all agree, and that foundational data. But also, I think, Monica, with the 1 billion people not being on the map, I think that also shows some of that worry that if people are not represented, how do we get that equality across the world? So thank you all for attending the session. That's been brilliant. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the event today. Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.